Hi everyone, I'm Bhante Sujato and I'm here to bring to you today the fourth in our series of 4 classes on the Visuddhimagga. And today we're looking at the section on wisdom, on paññā, or as Venerable Nyanamoli has translated it, understanding. And I am thrilled that we have got this far, and I'm so happy that we've been able to share some time together looking at the Visuddhimagga and sort of grappling with some of the complexities and some of the interesting ideas and perspectives that it's offering. I hope that in this session on paññā, on wisdom, that we can move towards at least some kind of perspective on the way that the Visuddhimagga is approaching its material. Now, obviously, the section on wisdom is the longest and the most complex section, and there are many whole regions of this teaching that we're just going to leave untouched. In particular, we're going to leave untouched the whole section on the vipassana knowledges, vipassana jnana, which obviously is incredibly influential in modern meditation. Rather, I'm going to focus on just one section, and that is the section on dependent origination. And that is one of the portions of the basic understanding of wisdom, which is collected under the heading of the soil in which understanding grows, the paññā bhumi nidesa. So this is like the ground of wisdom. And so dependent origination, of course, being one of the core wisdom teachings found in the suttas, prominently in the Nidana Samyutta. And the Visuddhimagga offering a variety of perspectives and insights into the nature of this teaching. Now, let's just plunge right into it. I hope that we can sort of get an overall perspective of the teaching on dependent origination, but even within this small portion of Visuddhimagga, we can only look at a small portion of that small portion. But at least I hope that we can get some kind of perspective on how it's approaching this material and the way that it's handling its sources and the kinds of inquiry and the kinds of perspectives that it's opening up. So we begin the section on understanding on page 479, or the beginning of chapter 14 in Nyanamoli's edition. And so all of the references, so begin with chapter 14. And Venerable Buddhaghosa recaps the verse that started it all. When a wise man established well in virtue develops consciousness and understanding, and then acknowledges that we have already looked at the first 2 parts of that, the virtue and the consciousness or samadhi, and now has time to look at the third, and that is wisdom or understanding. Now, Nyanamoli's choice of understanding to translate this is slightly unusual, and most translators, including myself, have chosen to translate paññā as wisdom. Understanding is, however, a very tempting rendering for paññā, and I was really on the fence about this. One of the problems with rendering paññā as wisdom is that wisdom has no verb to go with it. So the word pajjanati as a verb occurs very frequently in the suttas. And so you have to say, I understand, or one understands, whereas you can't say one wises up. Doesn't quite work. So this is to keep the connection between the noun and the verb. Understanding works much better than wisdom. Another reason to prefer understanding is that wisdom, in a sense, is deeper. Now, Pali has a lot of words for what we would think of as spiritual wisdom or spiritual understanding. We are used to seeing these words used in a profound sense because we see them within the context of the Buddha's teachings. But in fact, the words themselves are not necessarily particularly profound. The word paññā, or understanding or wisdom, is pretty much an ordinary word in the culture, and can be used for anything from kind of intelligence, cleverness, understanding, and so on. It doesn't necessarily have the sort of slightly profound sense that wisdom has. And so, in a sense, to under-render it, under-translate it, is a tempting approach. Eventually I settled on using wisdom, but maybe I'll go back to understanding at some point. Okay. So I won't go too much into those details about understanding and so on. Now, one of the things that we see in this particular approach is that there's a lot of emphasis on analysis, a lot of emphasis on categorization. We've already seen this in the previous chapters, but it becomes even greater in this chapter, and it becomes actually greater still in some of the other portions apart from the bits that we're looking at. Most of the time I'll skip over those bits because those bits require a lot of sort of detailed attention to looking at and discussing about how all of those things relate to each other, how certain things fit into each other, how these categories fit into those categories, and so on. And those things can be very useful as a way of honing your intelligence and honing your critical faculties, because it teaches you to be very clear about the kinds of conceptual distinctions that we're making. But in this particular context, it's going to just bog us down way too much. So I'm going to skip over a lot of those more detailed things and try to focus on more of a general overview. All right, so I'm going to skip over the sections on the aggregates and the faculties and so on. And we're going to go straight on to the section on dependent origination, somewhat confusingly titled The Conclusion in Nyanamoli section. It means the conclusion of the paññā bhumini desa, the conclusion of the section on the grounds of wisdom, the soil in which understanding grows. And that conclusion consists of the dependent origination. So that's chapter 17 in Nyanamoli's translation, and all of the references that I'll be giving from now on will be to this chapter. Okay. Now, okay, so let's just have a look at some selected passages here. First one I'll draw your attention to, paragraph 2. Firstly, it is the state beginning with ignorance that should be understood as dependent origination. So this is making an important distinction. It might seem like it's just a passing comment or not very significant, but it is very significant because what it means is that when we are talking about dependent origination, we need to distinguish between two kinds of things. One kind of thing that we can talk about is like a general principle of the idea of causality, the idea that things condition each other, that things only arise dependent on conditions, and so on and so forth. And that general principle, of course, applies very broadly. It's by no means limited to Buddhism, and within the suttas and within the Buddha's teachings, we see this applied in all kinds of different ways and contexts. The arising of states of samadhi depending on conditions, or the arising of, say, conflict in society is dependent on condition, or the arising of emotional distress is dependent on conditions, and so on. However, in this particular section, we're not dealing with conditionality in that very broad sense. We're looking at a specific application of that conditionality, and that's in terms of the 12 links that begin with ignorance. And this is the normal way that dependent origination is used within the Buddhist tradition. So it's important to make that distinction and to be clear in your mind that when we're talking about dependent origination, we're talking about this specific application of the 12 links. Sometimes the number of links varies in the way of teaching, but generally speaking, it's that same kind of pattern. All right. Now, the text makes a distinction between the dependent origination, that is the paticca-samuppada, and the dependently originated dhammas, the paticca-samuppanna dhamma. This is a distinction which, as the text is quoting from the suttas, is found in the suttas themselves. and so the dependent origination is the pattern or the structure by which things originate, and dependently originated dhammas is the things that are originated in that process. Okay. Now, skipping forward to section 8, the Visuddhimagga discusses a bit of a controversy. This is a bit of kind of monastic drama, if you will. The characteristic must be sought from grammar. Some, in fact, say that the expression paticca is characterized thus: having depended paticca, a right arising, samma upada, depending on causes rightly by disregarding such causes conjectured by sectarians, and so on. What they call dependent origination is a simple arising. Okay, so it's a somewhat kind of obscure tenet, but clearly Acharya Buddhaghosa is presenting a view or interpretation of the compound paticca as put forward by some in his day. Now, we don't really know who that some is, and there's various kind of discussion about this, but by some he's referring to, like, usually the specific opinions of well-known teachers at his time, or perhaps could be opinions found within the commentaries that he had before him, remembering that Buddhaghosa was the editor of these commentaries. But it doesn't really kind of make that clear. But the point here is that the idea of bare arising, now Buddhaghosa goes on to refute this idea at some length. I won't go into it too much because this is not really a controversy that we find today. It's a kind of an ancient controversy. But the idea is that it's simply the arising of one thing and the other, rather than treating it whole as a structure and as a stream of arising. It's like a kind of subtle philosophical difference. But I don't want to go into it in too much detail, but I just wanted to mention it in the sense that it's important to notice that there were controversies about interpretation, about certain points. The nature of controversies varies over time. Certain things matter in some ways to some people. With this particular controversy, I can see that, like, you know, there's a linguistic and grammatical argument to be made there, but I don't really understand why it matters. Like, why has somebody interpreted it in that way? And this is often the case with old controversies, that we should be careful about how we read them, because without understanding the personalities involved, without understanding their backgrounds and their perspectives, then it's difficult to understand the motives that are shaping the controversy, not just the details of who's right and who's wrong, but the more important thing about, like, what's the underlying issue? Why does it matter? Why did these people think that this was something that was worth having this discussion about? And of course, you know, also worth noting that, as always in the Buddhist tradition, almost always in the Buddhist tradition, that the controversy is discussed in a very reasonable and rational manner. There's no ad hominem attacks and all of these kinds of things, but a discussion of the issues. All right. Now, I'm going to skip ahead to section number 21 here, paragraph 21. All right. Now, this is a theme which I'll return to a number of times, or which Venerable Buddhaghosa returns to, and I'll highlight this. While termed, the first component will deny the false view of eternity, and so on. The second will prevent the nihilistic type of view and others like it, while the two together show the true way that is meant. All right. So here, Buddhaghosa is introducing the idea of eternalism and annihilationism as two frameworks that are reflected in the name dependent origination. Sorry, I probably misspoke. I said Buddhaghosa introduced that. In fact, he's quoting from a verse, and it's likely that the verse was in the commentaries he was reading from. So what does this mean here? So the word dependent, paticca, indicates the combination of the conditions, since states in the process of occurring exist in dependence on the combining of the conditions, and it shows that they're not eternal, etc., denying the various doctrines of eternalism, no cause, and so on and so forth. Right? So the point is that by looking at the idea of paticca, that things are dependent, then you're refuting the eternalistic ideas. If everything existed eternally always, how could they possibly be dependent? By the second, the word origination, samuppada, indicates the arising of the state, since these occurs when the conditions combine, and it shows how to prevent annihilationism, thus preventing the various kinds of annihilationism. How can the doctrine annihilate? When states are seen to arise again and again, each conditioned by its predecessor, how can the doctrines of annihilationism, nihilism, and moral inefficacy of action be maintained? Right? So can you see the point here that when things arise, we can observe that they condition other things. And so just as we can infer that the things that have arisen now have been dependent on some causes from the past, and that therefore there can't be such a thing as eternalism because everything has arisen from causes, at the same time, those causes don't just disappear. The states which are present also condition other things. And this is somewhat comparable to the idea, the laws of thermodynamics in physics, where the energy or matter is neither created nor destroyed. Matter or energy is neither created nor destroyed. It changes form. So what we are doing now, the action, the energy that we're doing, is a causal force that has an effect in the future. And so that shows that we can't accept the doctrines of annihilationism and nihilism and so on, which say that there is no effect of our actions in the future. So you can see that even in what the text is arguing is that distinction between annihilationism and eternalism is so fundamental and so basic to the very notion of dependent origination that we can see it in the very name itself. That's why it has that particular name. Okay. 25. All right, so having given a bit of an explanation as to the words dependent origination, paticca samuppada. They're going to go on. Oh, sorry, I forgot one thing. Just to return back to what I said before about the simple arising, the things just arising by themselves, Buddhaghosa refutes that by the idea that things arise together. And this is sometimes called co-arising. The word sam in samuppada literally can be rendered as co-arising. And sometimes today people will translate it as dependent co-arising. That is to say that the many things arise together in a way that has a structure and a flow to it. That's an alternative way of rendering it. I don't really like that way of rendering it because it sounds a bit too Buddhist hybrid English to me. Co-arising is not a word that you find outside of Buddhist circles. So, but certainly the idea is correct that we're talking here about a complex interrelation of conditions. And I think it's important to bear that in mind when thinking about like the string of 12 factors, that it's never really meant as a purely linear string. That's just a way of presenting it. In fact, those different conditions are always, even within the suttas, the many different kinds of ramifications and interrelations are shown between those. Sometimes the series will skip one or two factors, sometimes the order will be changed around, sometimes different things will be shown to influence different things and so on. So these are not meant to be like a rigid, linear, it's not like a domino sort of situation. But the basic 12 factors is there as a means of exposition. And the reason why that it's explained in that way is also addressed in the Visuddhimagga itself as being, again, to focus on the idea of annihilationism and eternalism. That is to say that certain of the factors will help to refute the fallacy of eternalism, and certain factors will help to refute the fallacy of annihilationism. All right. Now, Buddhaghosa has a bit of a preamble in section 25 of his approach. Now, in teaching this dependent origination, the Blessed One has set forth the text in the way beginning, and quoting from the Samyutta Nikaya, with ignorance as condition, there are formations. So taking the Nidana Samyutta as the fundamental text. Its meaning should be commented on by one who keeps within the circle of the vibhajjavādins. And this is the term vibhajjavāda is an interesting term in Buddhist history. It's used as Nyanamoli notes within the context of the suttas itself. And within the context of the suttas, it simply means that somebody who, the Buddha and his followers who do not rashly give unqualified answers to questions that need analysing before being answered. So that has a sort of somewhat limited meaning, but it came to have a more sectarian view gradually, remembering that when you're dealing with sectarian names in Buddhism, the choice of a sectarian name might reflect something about the emphasis of that particular group, but it doesn't necessarily distinguish it. Like when the school that we call Theravada today calls itself, as here, vibhajjavāda, the doctrine of analysis, as it follows the doctrine of analysis. That's not something which, say, the followers of Tibetan Buddhism or Chinese Buddhism would find alien or unusual to them. They also use analysis and would regard themselves as following the Buddha's teachings in practicing analysis. So the actual idea that you're following a doctrine of analysis is not necessarily something that's distinctive to the Theravadan school, but it is applied in a way that it became a sectarian name. It seems, and the usage of the term is a little bit obscure and probably changed over time, but the most simple and convenient way to think of the word vibhajjavāda is that it's a word for the group that's more or less left over from the other major groups among the early Buddhist schools. So in the history of early Buddhism, we have the first split was between the ancient Staviras and the Mahasangikas. I discussed all of this in my book, Sects and Sectarianism, which do yourself a favour. First split between the Staviras and the ancient Mahasangika. Mahasangika then, which just means the majority or the greater part of the Sangha. So the Mahasangika flourished for many years in India, but then faded away. Some of their ideas influenced the Mahayana, but it's a fallacy to say that Mahasangika evolved into Mahayana. Mahayana was a pan-Buddhist movement that evolved drawing from things that were found in many different schools and also many ideas that were found across all Buddhist schools, so including Mahasangika. So the Mahasangika was spread right across India, and their main doctrine was they were responsible for the idea that would tend to lower the status of the Arahant and raise up the status of the Bodhisattva and the Buddha. So whereas these things were relatively close in the time of the suttas, the Buddha was considered to be a special leading Arahant, but the freedom and release of an Arahant was the same, whereas Mahasangikas tended to move towards much more transcendental notion of Buddhahood. Again, that movement is something you find across all Buddhist schools, but perhaps more pronounced and led the way by the Mahasangika schools. Of the Stavira group, which is what left over, then they evolved into many different groups. They call 18 early schools, but actually only a fairly small number of major groups of schools, and those major groups of schools are the Sarvastivada, who had the doctrine, whose distinction was on the interpretation of impermanence. They interpreted impermanence as that things are efficient in the present moment, but they exist in the past, present, and future. The Pugalavadins, who had a doctrine, an interpretation of not self, which was that there is a person who is not a self, but which is a coherent entity that transmigrates through samsara. The Sarvastivadins, the Pugalavadins, and the vibhajjavādans. Is there one other group? I feel like I'm missing out one group. I may be missing out one group. And the vibhajjavādans are those who reject all of those other doctrines. And that group of the vibhajjavādans consisted of a number of schools, including the Dharmaguptakas of northwestern India, who formed the foundation for the monastic communities in China, and the school in Sri Lanka, who at the time was known as the Mahavihāravāsins, or as here the Vibhajjavādans, and who today we call the Theravadins. So the differences between the Vibhajjavadan schools at the time seem to be minor. Dharmaguptakas, Mahishasaka, Mahavihāravāsin, and others. In fact, it's not at all clear to what extent they saw themselves as different schools, and I believe that the founder of the Dharmaguptaka school was known as Yonika Dhammarakkhita, the Greek Dhammarakkhita. I believe that he visited Sri Lanka and that Sri Lankan scholars visited him in the northwest of India to discuss Abhidhamma and so on, and that there wasn't considered to be really any difference between the schools, at least in the early times. Of course, over time, they grew apart. But even in the Katawatu, which discusses all the differences in the doctrines between the schools, there's no real substantive difference between the Mahavihara and the Dharmaguptaka. Anyway, look, I'm getting off topic, I know, but I'm talking about what is the Vibhajjavadan. So when Buddhaghosa is using the word Vibhajjavadan, what he means is his school, which is primarily the Mahavihāravāsins, that is the group that he's associated with there. And it's a bit unclear, probably he does not mean the Dharmaguptakas and others. But when modern scholars use the word Vibhajjavadan, they typically will use it to include the Mahavihāravāsins, Dharmaguptakas, Ishasakas, and so on. It's a bit complicated, all right, but anyway, let us proceed. Okay. So meetings should be commented on by one who keeps within the circle of the Vibhajjavadins, who does not misrepresent the teachers, who does not advertise his own standpoint, who does not quarrel with the standpoints of others, and who does not distort suttas, who is in agreement with the Vinaya, who looks to the principal authorities, Mahapadesa, that is to say, to look to the suttas, who illustrates the Dhamma, who takes up the meaning, the Atta, repeatedly reverting to the same meaning, describing it in various different ways. Now, it is inherently difficult to comment on the dependent origination, as the ancients said, and here a quote from the old commentaries: the truth, a being, rebirth-linking, and the structure of conditions, these four things are very hard to see and likewise difficult to teach. Therefore, considering that to comment on the dependent origination is impossible, except for those who are expert in the texts, whilst I would, and again, coming back, reverting to verse, but in this case, seemingly his own verse. And, it's interesting that when he's speaking here in an unusually personal manner, that he is coming to a poetic expression. Whilst I would now begin the comment on the structure of conditions, I find no footing for support and seem to founder in a sea. However many mode of teaching graces the dispensation here, and still the former teacher's way is handed down unbrokenly. Therefore, on both of these relying for my support, I now begin its meaning to elucidate. Listen, therefore, attentively. For this has been said by the former teachers. Whoever learns alertedly this discourse will go from excellence to excellence, and when perfected, he will then escape beyond the vision of the King of Death. So that sounds excellent, right? We're going to escape the vision of the King of Death. That sounds like a good place to start. All right. Now, having expressed his own caution and giving some idea of the methods that he's going to be using, Venerable Buddhaghosa then goes on to give the quote-unquote brief exposition. Of course, the brief exposition goes on for quite a number of pages, actually. But anyway, so the brief exposition, I won't go into a lot of the ideas here, but the one which I think is the most interesting is the first part, which is about the different ways of teaching. So this is from section 28, section chapter 17, 28 onwards. As different ways of teaching, the Blessed One's teaching of dependent origination is fourfold, namely from the beginning, from the middle up to the end, from the end, or from the middle down to the beginning. Right? So from the beginning, from the middle up to the end, from the end backwards, or from the middle down to the beginning. It is like 4 creeper-gatherers' ways of seizing a creeper. For just as one of 4 men gathering creepers sees only the root of the creeper first, and after cutting at the root, he pulls it out and takes it away and uses it, so the Blessed One teaches dependent origination from the beginning to the end. It's the normal way of teaching it. Now, just as another one of the 4 men sees the middle of the creeper first, and after cutting in the middle, he pulls out only the upper part, takes it away and uses it, so the Buddha teaches it from the middle up to the end. Thus, when he's delighted with welcomes and remains committed to that feeling, delight arises in him, delight in feelings is clinging, and so on. So it's starting in the middle. Just as another one of the 4 men sees the tip of the creeper first, and seizing the tip, he follows it down to the root and then takes it away, so the Blessed One teaches it from the end down to the beginning, with birth as conditioning, aging and death, and so on. And just as one of the 4 men sees only the middle of the creeper first, and after cutting it in the middle and tracing it back as far as the root, he takes it away and uses it, so the Blessed One teaches it from the middle down to the beginning. What are these 4 nutriments? What is their cause and source? So he gives a quote for each one of those. So these are the different methods of teaching which we find in the suttas. And of course, one of the roles of the commentary is to look at these different teachings given at different places and different times and try to get a handle on what's the relations between them. And remembering, of course, that in the Buddha's day, we can trust that the Buddha, as the greatest teacher, would know what is the right thing for you in that time and that place. But when we come to read the suttas, we don't really know that. So the commentary is sort of giving us some kind of handle as to what to look for in seeing the perspective of these different teachings. So why does he teach it thus? Because the dependent origination is wholly beneficial, and because he has himself acquired elegance in instructing. Elegance in instructing. For the dependent origination is entirely beneficial, starting from any one of the 4 starting points, it leads only to the penetration of the proper way. But it goes in particular from section 34, when he sees that people are susceptible of teaching, are confused about the analysis of the causes of the process of existence, he employs his teaching of it forward, starting from the beginning, in order to show that the process carries on according to its own peculiar laws and for the purpose of showing the order of arising. And when he surveys the world as so this is the first thing, right? You look at it from the beginning when someone has a lack of understanding about what are the causes. Then when he surveys the world as fallen in trouble, then he employs his teaching as if backwards, starting from the front. Okay. So if you start with the assumption of suffering and come back to the front, it should be recognized he employs his teaching of it backwards from the middle down to the beginning, in order to show the succession of cause and fruit extends back into the past and again forwards from the past, in accordance with his definition of nutriment as the source. And it should be recognized he employs his teaching of it forwards from the middle up to the end, in order to show how the future existence follows on through rebirth from arousing in the present. Right? So if we want to look at how the present is creating the future, then we start in the middle. Of these methods of presentation, that cited here should be understood as that stating forward order. So in other words, here in this book, we're looking at it from the forward order. Okay, in section 36 and 37, he asks whether ignorance is the primordial root cause, that is, whether there's a fundamental causeless cause, and of course denies that that's the fact, and this is a fundamental principle of causality understood well by all the different schools of Buddhism. We don't embrace the idea of a causeless cause, as opposed to the theistic systems, which have the idea of God as a uncreated creator, as a prime mover, and this, of course, creating fundamental philosophical problems in the notion of causality. Okay, so I'm going to again skip ahead. Teaching 58, ignorance. Okay, so we'll come up to, we won't go into all of the details of each factor, but I'll look briefly at the explanations of each factor. In section number 58, ignorance is unknowing about the four instances beginning with suffering, in other words, about the Four Noble Truths. And it gives a further explanation according to Abhidhamma. But the basic idea is that ignorance is not knowing about the Four Noble Truths. Fine. So formations, the next one in Pali, Sankhara, Nyanamoli here translating as formations. I think a very unfortunate translation. Sankhara has a meaning of activities, volitional activities, or as I render it these days, as choices. So it has an active thing. So if we look at the explanation here, the three formations of merit and the bodily formations, the blah, 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 different volitions and so on. So he's explaining this as the bodily formation is bodily volitions, verbal formation is verbal volition, and mental formation is mental volition. In other words, sankhara means volition or cetana. So we should really translate it in a way that's going to bring that meaning to the fore. All right. I will now skip ahead a little bit. Okay, so the text then goes on to the 24 conditions of the Patthāna. Now, this is now section 66. I won't go into detail into this, but just for the context is that the Patthāna is one of the 7 books of the canonical Theravadan Abhidhamma. It is the concluding book of the Abhidhamma, and in a way it's, together with the Dhammasangani, provides the overarching framework of it. Dhammasangani begins the Abhidhamma, the Patthāna ends it. And whereas in dependent origination, right at the beginning we saw that distinction between the dependent origination, that is the structure of causality, and the dependently originated dhammas, that is the things dependently originated. And that twofold structure is reflected in the Abhidhamma, where the Dhammasangani is talking about the things that are dependently originated, what dhammas there are in the world, what phenomena there are, and the Patthāna is talking about the relationship between them. And of course, this is talking about it in a much more complicated, much more comprehensive way than we find in the Sutta teaching on dependent origination. So the Patthāna offers a system of 24 different kinds of conditions, and then takes all the different kinds of phenomena that's listed in the Dhammasangani. So there's whatever 100-something phenomena listed in Dhammasangani and 24 conditions listed in the Patthāna, and then you link them all up, and so you combine them all in every conceivable possible way. And as a result, Patthāna becomes extremely long. But the basic idea behind the Patthāna is relatively simple, that there are different kinds of conditionality that apply in different contexts, and that we can illuminate the relation between phenomena by understanding something of these different kinds of conditions. If we look at the conditions as listed here, you can see that there are certain things that are like very context specific, something like, say, jhana condition, the conditionality of things due to their presence or absence in the context of jhana meditation. Right? So this is a very contextually specific kind of conditionality. Other kinds of conditionality mentioned here are more kind of general. For example, if you look at the trilogy of the Sahajata Paccaya, Purejata Paccaya, Paccajata Paccaya. Sahajata Paccaya is things that are originated at the same time. So, for example, consider, say, the organs of the body. Right? So when a child is born, all of the organs of the body are originated at the same time, and they will nourish and support each other. So this is a kind of Sahajata Paccaya. Purejata Paccaya is a pre-nascent condition, something that was originated beforehand. So you need to, in order for the baby to be born, then you need to have a mother. So the mother is a Purejata Paccaya, or a pre-nascent condition. But then once the baby is born, then the baby needs nourishing. For example, as it grows older, the baby will be eating rice. And that rice may be planted after the baby is born, right? So that it's nourishing and continuing the baby, even though actually it was originated after the baby was. So this is some kind of analysis of these things. And so that particular one is applying in different, in the context of time. Other conditions apply in different ways. Of all of these conditions, perhaps the most relevant and the ones to keep an eye out for is the one that's called the Upanishaya paññā, which is here called the decisive support condition. And the point about the decisive support condition is that if you look at conditionality for things, a lot of conditionality rapidly becomes so complex that it gets very boring. So again, to come back to something simple like the growing of rice, what are the conditions needed for the growing of rice? Well, you need to have ground, you need to have life on earth, you need to have a sun, you need to have gravity, you need to have atoms, you need to have fundamental physical forces, you need all of these things that we need. And if we're going to list all of those things, it's going to take quite a long time if we're going to list that in every case. So Upanishaya paññā is looking at, well, what is the decisive thing that's actually most immediately relevant for producing that result in that context. So here you might consider the Upanishaya paññā being somebody goes out onto the field and throws down some seeds onto the field as the decisive support for the growing of rice. All right, so I will then skip over the detailed discussion of the different conditions here. I will also skip over the way that they're applied to the structure of conditionality. So what the Visuddhimagga is doing is taking these conditions and then applying them and reflecting on them in the context of dependent origination, which the Patthāna itself does not actually do. All right. Now, come on to a few important reflections. Paragraph number 105. Here it may be stated, but how is this? Is ignorance the only condition for formations? Or are there other conditions? What is the position here? For firstly, if it is the only one, there follows the assertion of a single cause. But then if there are others, the description of it as a single cause, namely with ignorance as condition, there are formations, is incorrect. It is not incorrect. Why not? Here is the reason. Nor from a single cause arise one fruit or many, nor one fruit from many. 'Tis helpful, though, to utilize one cause and fruit as representative. Okay, so this is just a very important thing to bear in mind, and this relates to what I was saying before, that even though we present dependent origination as a linear sequence, it's never really meant that way in a literal sense. Okay. Good. Where are we now? 121. Skipping forward to paragraph 121. All right. Here it may be asked, but how is it to be known? So we're now talking about consciousness. All right? Vijnana. Sankhara paccaya vijnana. And of course, if ignorance is not understanding the Four Noble Truths, sankhara or choices is the meritorious, demeritorious, good and bad choices that we make, that make a karma, that produce, that fuel consciousness, then consciousness is the result of those choices. And how do we know that this consciousness has been produced by our choices, by our karma in past lives? Because there is no karma result when there is no stored up karma. Okay? For this consciousness is karma result, and karma result does not arise in the absence of stored up karma. Right? So in other words, because we have this consciousness, which is a resultant thing, like it's caused by something. So we can see that it must be caused by some kind of cause in the past life. If it did, then all kinds of karma resultant consciousness would arise in all kinds of beings, and they do not so. Right? So here's an argument from specificity. For example, if you compare it to a agricultural metaphor. How do we know that this mango tree has originated from a mango seed? Well, because when you put down mango seeds, then they always give mango fruit, mango trees. And when you put down rice, then they always go rice, and those things are not mixed up. So it's a subtle point, and I'm not sure that it really kind of adequately answers the problem, but at least it's a start. It's one of the ways, and you can see that this is one of the characteristics when we talk about the vibhajjavāda and the school of analysis. This is one of the characteristics of the vibhajjavādan approach to wisdom, is that always looking to understand things by breaking down a complex thing into smaller parts. Of course, that's an essential method, right? I mean, you have to do this, basic to any form of education. If you want to convey the understanding of a subject, you have to break it down into the bits. So when looking at this, when understanding this approach, it's also, I think, important to remember that as well as breaking things down into bits, we also need to see things in a holistic way. Okay. Right. Now, if we move forward to section 126 and 127, then we're talking about the different kinds of consciousness and different kinds of resultant consciousness. And the text makes a fundamental distinction between the consciousness that's occurring in this life, in the course of one existence, one bhava, and the consciousness which occurs at the moment of rebirth. It's called the patisandhi vijnana. Now, this is one of the areas where I believe that the Visuddhimagga is somewhat given a disservice in a lot of modern presentations, because it's kind of conventional to say that the vijnana in dependent origination is the patisandhi vijnana. This is clearly reductive. The suttas speak of the stream of consciousness established in this life and established in the next. And the occurrence of vijnana or consciousness at the moment of taking rebirth, of course, is an important part of that, but it's not the whole thing. And so when you see vijnana in dependent origination translated as rebirth-linking consciousness, this is imposing a rendering which is certainly not derived from the suttas, and equally it's not founded in the Visuddhimagga either, because the Visuddhimagga is quite clearly acknowledging that there are these two aspects of vijnana, the aspect of vijnana as it's happening in the life, consciousness throughout the stream of life, and the consciousness at the moment of rebirth. Okay. Okay, I won't go into all the details of that, but I'll just discuss a little bit about the notion of the rebirth-linking consciousness, because it's quite obviously an important concept here. So the idea is that that in dependent origination, according to this exposition, there's a kind of a special focus on this function of vijnana as a sort of like almost like a kind of a mirror that reflects both sides of one life onto the next. And there's an extensive discussion about what exactly happens there in terms of the mental processes, the psychology of what's actually going on there in different cases. And some of the most interesting discussions are talking about the nimitta that occurs at that point. Now, from section 134 onwards, it discusses this in terms of perception at that time of death, of things that are either past or present or future, or not so classifiable. The concept of not so classifiable is a Abhidhamma idea. As what it simply means is that it's something that doesn't fit into the categorization scheme which is currently being used. So something which doesn't neatly fit into the past, present, and future. According to Theravadan philosophy, a concept, that is a paññāti, is something which doesn't exist in the past, present, and future. It's a somewhat complicated philosophical idea, but this is what it's referring here. And so when it's talking about what's not so classifiable, what it's meaning is the nimitta, that is to say the conceptual perception, which can arise at those times. And that perception is something that doesn't really exist. I mean, the perception of the nimitta obviously exists at a certain time, that you perceive the nimitta at a certain time, but the nimitta itself, as a sort of abstract concept or idea, can't really be said to exist at a period of time. I know it's a very subtle distinction. Think about it in terms of, just think about it as in terms of an idea. You say, well, does the idea of democracy exist in the past or the present or the future? Well, you can talk about historically when it was talked about and these kinds of things. You can talk about the history of the word, but the concept of democracy is something that really is timeless. It doesn't really exist in the past, present, or future. It's not so classifiable. Or the concept of redness, for example, is something that's not so classifiable. Anyway, that's just so that you can understand what exactly it's getting at there. All right, so the idea here is that when coming to the end of a life, that there's a slowing and a cutting off of a stream of consciousness from one life, dependent on the conditions that have brought you to that place. And then you may have a vision of some kind of act that you've done in the past. So in section number 140, it talks about that. In the case of one in a happy destiny who has stored up blameless karma, when he's lying on his deathbed, his blameless karma, according as it has been stored up, or its sign, comes into focus in the mind door. For it is said, then the good deeds he did in the past cover him and overspread him and envelop him, being a quote from the Majjhima Nikaya. So then with the idea when you're on your deathbed that you might recollect the deeds that you did that were good, or there may be like a sign of those deeds. It might be like a reflection or an echo of those deeds. It might be like a happy image or a light in the mind or something like that, which symbolizes or reflects in some way those good deeds. And then when that comes, then that is followed by the rebirth in a good realm. So at the time of death, sometimes will come into view the appearance of the mother's womb in the case of the human realm, or the appearance of pleasure groves, divine palaces, and wishing trees. Interestingly enough, the sub-commentary adds that the appearance of the mother's womb appears like a woolen slipper. Interesting. Divine palaces, wishing trees, etc. in the case of the divine world. His rebirth-linking arises next to the death consciousness in the order shown for the sign of an unhappy destiny. So in another case, the relatives present objects to him at the 5 sense doors, such as visible datum, perhaps flowers and so on. This is being offered to the Buddha. For your sake, dear, set your mind at rest. Or perhaps they make a sound like the preaching of Dhamma or offerings of music and so on. Now, when that visible datum or whatever object has come into focus, the consciousness ending in determining have arisen in due succession. There arise in him impulsion. That impulsion is the active form of karma, numbering 5 because of slowing down near to the nearest of death, and 2 registration. After that, 1 death consciousness, making the life continuous objective field as object. All right. So then rebirth linking arises, which only takes 1 mind moment. All right, so again, not going too much into all of these details, but the basic idea is clear enough that as we approach the time of death, then there will be something which arises from the past, present, and future, a vision of the future life, a recollection of the past life, a sign or nimitta or something like that, and then the moment of death comes, and that rebirth linking will connect one into the birth into the next life. Okay. Now, where are we? Okay, so there's a nice little explanation offered in section 161, paragraph 161, 62, and 63. A mere state that has got its conditions ushers in the ensuing existence. While it does not migrate from the past with no cause in the past, it is not. So it is a mere material and immaterial state arising when it has obtained its conditions that is spoken of, saying that it comes into the next becoming, next life. It is not a lasting being, not a soul, and is neither transmigrated from the past life, nor yet is it manifested here without cause from that. We shall explain this by the normal process of human death and rebirth linking. When in the past life, Nyanamola is using becoming for bhava here, but in the past life, a man near to a natural or violent death is unable to bear the onset of the unbearable daggers of the painful feelings that end in death. As they sever the ligatures of the joints in all the limbs, his body gradually withers like a palm tree leaf lying in the glare of the sun. And when the faculties of the eye, etc., have ceased, and the body faculty, mind faculty, and life faculty remain on in the heart basis alone, then, right, so in the suffering in the extremity of death, senses disappear, only the faculties left in the heart. Then consciousness, which has as its support the heart basis still remaining at that moment, either occurs contingent on some karma classed as weighty, repeated, or performed near to death, as previously, and it gives the reference there to look at that discussion. In other words, the formation or the karma that is obtained, the remaining conditions or contingent upon the objective field made to appear by that karma. In other words, the sign of that karma or the sign of the destiny. Right? So you might have a nimitta, a sign of the karma that you've done or of the destiny that you're going to. And while it is occurring thus, because craving and ignorance have not been abandoned, craving pushes it, and the connascent formations, again connascent, we mentioned before, arising together at the same time. So it's the craving and the karma, the formations that arise at the same time. Fling it forward onto that objective field, right? That thing that you've just been aware of. You're being flung to, you have that vision, that nimitta of that, and you're flung through to the objective field. That is the objective reality, the new life that corresponds with that nimitta that you've just had. The dangers in which are concealed by ignorance, right? So you get this vision and the mind is being flung to it by craving, but because of that craving and that ignorance in the mind, you can't actually see the reality of that. And while, as a continuous process, it is being pushed by craving and flung forward by formations, it abandons its former support, right? The attachment to the former life, and flung forward by formations, by intention, by choice. Like a man who crosses a river by hanging onto a rope, tied to a rope on the near bank, and whether or not it gets a further support originated by karma, it occurs by means of the conditions consisting only in object condition and so on. All right, so there's a nice description, giving a more kind of natural language description of that process of rebirth and what the Visuddhimagga is talking about there. All right. Next, also another interesting one in subsequent paragraphs, paragraph 165 and forward, an echo or its like supplies the figures here. Connectedness by continuity denies identity and otherness. And here, let the illustration of this consciousness be such things as an echo, a light, a seal impression, a looking glass image. For the fact of its not coming here from the previous life, and for the fact that it arises owing to causes that are included in past lives. For just as an echo, a light, a seal impression, and a shadow have respectively sound, etc., as their cause and come into being without going elsewhere, so also this consciousness. So these are like a series of metaphors that the text is offering us as a way of understanding this process. And they're interesting, I think, quite intriguing metaphors for that process of the transferring of some kind of pattern, some kind of information, right? That consciousness, but without the transference of a physical substance from one place to another. And with a stream of continuity, there is neither identity nor otherness. For if there were absolute identity in a stream of continuity, there would be no forming of curd from milk. This being a classic process of conditionality that is talked about in the suttas a lot. And so the curd is created from the milk, and yet if there were absolute otherness, the curd would not be derived from the milk. And so too with all causally originated things. And if that was so, there would be an end to all worldly usage, which is hardly desirable. So neither absolute identity nor absolute otherness should be assumed here. Okay, good. Another interesting point raised in the following paragraphs. Here it might be asked, if no transmigration is manifested, then, after the cessation of the aggregates in this human person, that fruit could be another person's, or due to another karma, since the karma that is a condition for the fruit does not pass on to where that fruit is. And whose is the fruit, since there is no experiencer? Therefore, this formulation seems to be unsatisfactory. Right? So the point here is talking about moral responsibility, remembering that moral responsibility is the very heart of the whole idea of karma, that we are responsible for our deeds. And the self-doctrine explains that by saying it's the same person who does this who experiences the result. Therefore, this person must take responsibility for their deeds. Whereas here, since there's no self, there's no absolute identity of the doer and the result, then who is to take responsibility? And the reply, in continuity, the fruit is neither of nor from another. Seeds forming processes will suit to show the purport of this matter. When a fruit arises in a single continuity, it is neither another's nor from another karma, because absolute identity and absolute otherness are excluded there, as we just saw. The formative processes of seeds establish the meaning of this. For once the formative processes of a mango seed, etc., have been set afoot, when that particular fruit arises in the continuity of the seed's growth later on, owing to the obtaining of conditions, it does so neither as the fruit of other seeds, nor from other formative processes as condition. And those seeds or formative processes do not themselves pass on to the place where that fruit is. This is the analogy here. And the meaning can also be understood from the fact that the arts, crafts, medicine, etc., learned in youth give their fruit later on in maturity. Whose is the fruit is the question, since there is no experiencer. Experiencer is a convention for mere arising of the fruit. They say it fruits as a convention when on a tree appears as fruit. Okay, so it goes on with more explanation in that way, but we can see what is the manner of discourse and the manner of discussion here is that the text is drawing upon similes and experiences of common everyday things found in life, just as we find in the suttas, or used all the time, and using those to engage in a rational debate about these things, where it's assumed that we can infer from those specific observations to general principles about the nature of consciousness, the nature of life, the nature of existence itself. And notice how this method is very much in line with the methods used by science. In science, of course, you observe specific, particular material things. There's an apple falling off a tree, and therefore you draw a conclusion about the theory of gravity. So it's the same kind of process which is at work here. And this very much, I think, illuminates the spirit of the sort of Buddhist tradition and Buddhist philosophical tradition, that when it's doing its job, and I think sometimes it probably gets lost along the way, but when it's doing its job, it should remain close to experience, something close to what is shared and what is comprehensible. And it proceeds on a faith that the universe, spiritually speaking, operates according to comprehensible principles and laws, just as the physical world is assumed by scientists to operate according to comprehensible principles and laws. All right, let us continue. The next section we're going to look at is a section on namarupa, translated here as mentality, materiality, and sometimes translated as mind and matter, and so on. I'm not going to dwell too much on namarupa in this particular case, but just to note in passing that in the very first definition here, by analysis of mind and matter here, mind equals nama is the three aggregates, that is feeling, perception, and formations. This is also worth noting because in modern day Theravadan texts, it's very common to find that nama is defined as being the four aggregates, that is feeling, perception, choices or sankharas, and consciousness or vijnana. Clearly that can't be the case in dependent origination because vijnana is the cause of namarupa. So again, it's an area where I think that it's important that we don't blame the Visuddhimagga for the sometimes issues that arise in the presenting of the Dhamma in the current day. Okay, so namarupa, according to Visuddhimagga, essentially is the four khandhas that are apart from vijnana, that is to say rupa khandha as the physical world or material world, and the three immaterial khandhas of feeling, perception, and choices. The whole question and nature of namarupa is a very interesting one, and its relationship with consciousness is a very interesting one. Unfortunately, I'm not going to go into it, so bad luck. I've talked about this on many, many occasions, so you'll just have to go and find one of those. I'm going to move ahead. Right, where are we now? Namarupa, craving. Okay, so very briefly on craving and clinging. Now, craving, of course, fundamental principle of Buddhism, that this is the section number 233. And we have the 6 kinds of craving as found in the teaching on dependent origination, craving for sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch, and dhammas, mind objects or thoughts. Then each of those can be analyzed in terms of the 3 kinds of craving as craving found, three kinds of craving that are normally found in the analysis of the Four Noble Truths. That is to say, craving for sense desires, craving for bhava, that is to mean craving for continued existence, to be reborn, and craving for for vibhava, that is craving to be annihilated. Now, so these 3 forms, sensual craving, craving to continue to live, craving to be annihilated, these are like 3 kind of primal drives. Right? So in Freudian terms, or psychological terms, karma, tanha is like eros, is the desire for pleasure. Bhava tanha is the craving for life. I can't remember if there's a Latin name for that, but the word thanatos is used for the craving for to be annihilated or to be killed, to end. And so the point here is that these 3-fold cravings are not separate from the 6th craving of the senses, but each of the 6 craving of the senses can be interpreted in these 3 ways, giving 18 kinds in all. The critical thing to remember about craving is that craving always refers to very fundamental primordial drives. All right? So these are primordial drives, almost like these are, I mean, they can be conscious, but they're often unconscious. We don't often consciously think that we want to end ourselves, but we often act in ways that betray an unconscious desire for vibhava tanha. Moving on to clinging, or upadana, I prefer grasping to clinging. Then the upadana, of course, in the suttas is the 4-fold, the sense desire clinging, clinging to views, clinging to rites and rituals, and clinging to a doctrine of self. And the main distinction between craving and clinging, or craving and grasping, is that grasping is more sophisticated and more evolved. Think of it in terms of a child development. Right? When a child is just born, or even say an animal, then they have sensual desire, they have craving, wanting to live, and so on, but they don't have attachment to a theory of a self. They don't have attachment to performing rites and rituals. These are things that have to be learned. So upadana is a more sophisticated, more conceptual form of attachment that arises during the processes of development, fueled by craving. All right, so again, I won't go into too much detail there. I'll skip forward to bhava on paragraph number 250. As I mentioned just a little bit before, I really dislike the translation "becoming" for bhava. I think it's just incorrect. Nyanamoli's translations, while he was the great founder of translation, it's important, I think, also to remember that he was influenced a lot by existential thinking at the time, and so his translations, especially around the words being, becoming, existence, and so on, are in some ways reflecting or capturing his interest in European existentialism. Not that that's a bad thing, I'm just saying that there's just to understand the perspective that he's coming from. So bhava, excuse me, bhava is talking about essentially meaning life and the process of life, and is mostly distinguished here into two kinds. That is to say, the karma bhava is the active form of life, and the upati bhava is the rebirth, the resultant form of bhava. This reflects the nature of existence itself. Existence has passive and active dimensions, if you like. We are here, we're just sort of, here we are, and this is what we see, this is where we are, and somehow we respond to that. And so that upati bhava is the situation that we ended up in the process of rebirth, and then the karma bhava is what we do about that. All right, again, moving onwards. Gives a couple of examples of these kinds of things. Someone who thinks, this is section 262, someone who thinks in accordance with hearsay or false view that sense desires come to be fulfilled in the human world among the great warrior families, etc., and in the 6 divine worlds of the sense sphere. So it's something that you hear, misled by listening to wrong doctrine and imagining that by this karma sense desires will come to be fulfilled. He performs, for the purpose of attaining them, acts of bodily misconduct, etc., through sense desire clinging. So by fulfilling such misconduct, he's reborn in the states of loss. Or he performs acts of bodily misconduct, aspiring to sense desires visible here and now, and protecting those he's already acquired. By fulfilling such misconduct, he is reborn in the states of loss. The karma that is the cause of rebirth there is the karma process becoming, the karma bhava. The aggregates generated by the karma are the rebirth process becoming, the upati bhava, the upati bhava, I guess the rebirth life, and so on. All right. And on section 270, then we come to talk about birth, and of course, birth and aging and death are, as in the suttas, entirely about physical and organic birth, not about the idea of psychological birth, which is an idea not found in the suttas at all. Finally, in the, I guess, conclusion of the conclusion, we introduce, the text introduces the notion of the wheel of bhava, the wheel of life, the bhava chakra. This is very interesting because, of course, the wheel of life is very familiar from the Tibetan drawings with the beautiful illustrations of samsara and the 12 links of dependent origination and so on. And that's a fantastic teaching tool for understanding dependent origination. And it's interesting that the notion of that wheel was introduced here in the Theravadan tradition as well. It's not found in the suttas in this way. So the suttas don't talk about a bhava chakra or don't present dependent origination as a wheel, but it's a kind of an inference from it. And he explains that that when you encounter suffering at the end of dependent origination, then this creates distress and so on, which fuels ignorance, and then that starts the process once more. So this process, again, is not something linear, but something which keeps on cycling around. In section 283 is also interesting because there he introduces the notion of emptiness. And the emptiness was famously associated with dependent origination in the teachings of Nagarjuna. And Nagarjuna quoted from a sutta saying that dependent origination was emptiness. And curiously, that sutta is found in the Sanskrit agamas, Samyukta Agama, and yet is not found in the Pali agamas, and Pali Nikayas. Whether it's something that was added to the Sanskrit text or lost from the Pali text seems unclear. But regardless of whether that particular phrase is found in the Pali, it's nevertheless the case that the notion of emptiness is still introduced by Buddhaghosa here in the context of dependent origination. Ignorance and likewise the factors consisting of formations is void of lastingness, since its nature is to rise and fall, void of beauty, void of pleasure, void of selfhood. All right, so on section 284, paragraph 284, there are a few, another interesting idea that introduces the relation between the different times or different manners of teaching and the temperaments of people who are being taught. So that is to say, are we orientating dependent origination to the past, like where we've come from, the ignorance and so on we've come from? Are we orientating it to the present, the experience that we're having now, or are we orientating it to the future, like where our path is going to be leading us to? The first applies to one whose temperament is false view, and the second to one whose temperament is craving. For the round of rebirths, ignorance leads those whose temperament favors false view. Right? So if your mind is more of a theoretical type, you like to think that you have ideas and understand things, then your ignorance is likely to ignorance leading your false view. Whereas if your temperament favors craving, that is perhaps you're more of a sensualist, somebody who follows your desires, then the second part of dependent origination is more suitable for you. Or the first, looking to the past, has a more is to counter the eliminating the annihilation view, because by the evidence of the fruit, that is the fact that we're here now, it proves that there's no annihilation of the causes. The second, that is from craving forward, has the purpose of eliminating the eternity view, because it proves the aging of death of whatever has arisen. Well, the first deals with the child in the womb, because it illustrates successive occurrence of the faculties. Back to ignorance, we look at the child of the womb. The second deals with the apparitionally born because of their simultaneous appearance. Not sure about that one. But the basic point here, I think, is a really good one, that these different aspects of dependent origination, not only is there like a linear sequence, not only is that linear sequence ramified and complexified by the different systematic interrelation of things, but the way that that's applied and taught will have a different kind of psychological effect depending on the mind of the person who's understanding it. And this is drawing on something that, again, has, like so many things in Buddhist philosophy, has roots in the Kaccayana Sutta or the Samyutta Nikaya, where the Buddha says, points out to something that's very similar to what's being said here. Next thing I'd like to point to is paragraph number 298. Here it says, with triple round it spins forever. Formations and becoming, that is choices and life, especially karma bhava, the active side of life we discussed before, are the round of karma, the karma vata. Ignorance, craving, and clinging are the round of defilements. So these three aspects, ignorance, craving, and clinging, are all part of the kilesa, part of defilements, and they all belong together. Consciousness, namarupa, the sixfold base, contact and feeling, are the round of result. Okay, so these are the passive side of life. So this is how this wheel of becoming spins with these three things. And that division into those threefold aspects of dependent origination is also something which is drawn from the suttas. It doesn't give the sutta quote here, but if you look at something like the Bhava Sutta of the Nidana Samyutta, then that will present the Dhamma in a way that's very similar to that threefold division. So this is a useful way of understanding it, because you can see that certain factors in dependent origination are similar to other factors, and certain factors are dissimilar, but they're not identical. And so that, say, ignorance and craving are similar in one way. They both represent defilements, but they also represent those defilements in a different way. Ignorance being related, as we just saw, more to a conceptual and a cognitive unknowing, whereas craving being related more to an emotional drive or need. All right. So finally, Venerable Buddhaghosa wraps up by saying, there is no one, section 344, there is no one even in a dream who has got out of the fearful round of rebirths, which is ever destroying like a thunderbolt, unless he is severed with the knife of knowledge, well whetted on the stone of sublime concentration, this wheel of becoming which offers no footing owing to its great profundity, and is hard to get by owing to the maze of many methods. And this has been said by the Blessed One, this dependent origination is profound, ananda, and profound it appears. So this is the summary of the dependent origination, and I think we'll agree with Venerable Buddhaghosa that it is indeed a difficult topic to grasp, and there are indeed a maze of methods. This shouldn't be seen as something which is intimidating or forbidding, but it should be seen as something which is very fruitful. It's something which gives you a lot of room to explore. And the further and further we go into the teaching of dependent origination, the more vistas it opens up, and the more that you can see that the wisdom that's embodied in these patterns is indeed very profound. There are many dimensions and many depths to it, even apart from the very analytical and Abhidhamma-focused method that Buddhaghosa is used. There are many different other ways that we can use to look at dependent origination, and I've talked about that in some of the other talks that I've given, but I think you'll agree that that's enough for now. So thanks for your attention, and I look forward to having a discussion about